Thank you very much, Bob, and I hope you could all hear me. It's really terrific to have the opportunity to welcome Peter to the University of Waterloo. I guess not entirely welcoming him. He's been here a day or so, but for those of you who are new to this symposium, Peter and I have known each other for too long. I was thinking about this. It actually goes back 28 years, 1986. I remember very well my first conversation with Peter. We had both very fortunate to receive SSRC MacArthur Fellowships in International Security. And I think we met in Williamsburg and had a conversation. I think yours was a postdoc, is that correct? And I was a doctoral fellow. That was an enormously exciting program in the midst of a very contentious period of US-Soviet relations in those days. A lot of concern about international security. And the MacArthur Foundation was working with the Social Science Research Council in New York to try to open up new thinking about security issues. And Peter had already done a great deal of thinking about natural resources and water and international security. I was working on some other aspects of international security, but that's where we first encountered each other and met many times over the subsequent 2 years to think about various aspects of international security in the 1980s. I came on back to Canada, to the University of Toronto, and began a research project on environmental change and conflict around the world. And of course, one of the things we were very interested in was understanding the role of water in conflict, civil violence, for instance, within societies, revolution, rebellion, ethnic conflict, perhaps even genocide. What role could water scarcity play in problems like that? And I immediately thought of Peter and engaged him in our research project, which continued for a number of years until the mid-1990s. And so we had a lot to do with each other over the years. And it was a remarkably rewarding experience for me in working with Peter. His contribution to our project was enormously constructive, and I think he really helped make it a pioneering effort in understanding the relationship between environmental stress and violent conflict, an issue that has not gone away, and in fact may become even more germane through this century as climate change worsens. I want to say personally that I always greatly appreciated Peter's openness to new ideas. We had a big team, up to 100 people working on this work at one point, all engaged in projects around the world, but Peter was centrally involved as an advisor. He was enormously open to new ideas and engaging with other scholars and other students we brought together, exhibited great intellectual curiosity, a deep sense of humanity and passion. I always noted this, a passionate concern for the future. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Peter has, in the subsequent 2 decades, more than 2 decades, has fundamentally influenced the conversation about water issues around the world with his work principally at the Pacific Institute in Oakland, California. Now, I have a couple of formal paragraphs of biography, which I'll read now. As by way of introduction, Dr. Peter Gleick is a leading scientist, innovator, and communicator on global water and climate issues. He received the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, which was different from the one we received back in the 1980s. MacArthur Fellowship, sometimes called the Genius Fellowship, in 2003, and has been named by the BBC a visionary on the environment. He was elected in 2006 to the US National Academy of Sciences. He co-founded and leads the Pacific Institute in Oakland, California, which is one of the most innovative, independent, non-governmental organizations addressing the connection between the environment and global sustainability. Dr. Gleick is the author of many scientific papers and 10 books, including the influential series, The World's Water, which is on many people's bookshelves or in PDF form in their computers now and as a standard reference. And also he's written Bottled and Sold, the story behind our obsession with bottled water, which was published by Island Press, as well as a 21st century guide to US water policy, or actually a 21st century US water policy released in 2012. He is a graduate of Yale University and the University of California, Berkeley, where he received his MA, MS, and PhD. And I believe your advisor was John Holdren, who is now President Obama's science advisor. So we're going to have a real treat to listen to Peter today. We could not have a more informed person in our midst about world water issues, and I'd like us all to give him a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ted, for that very generous introduction. It's true, we go back a long way. I haven't seen Tad for many years, but Tad himself, as probably all of you know, has been extraordinarily influential in the areas that he described, and doing some of the earliest work on environment and security that still defines the field today. And thank you, Bob, and the Water Institute, and it's been really a remarkable day already. For those of you who were at the symposium, there were some really tremendous talks. There were some great posters. I don't know if the posters are still out there, but the students are doing some amazing work. Congratulations to all the scholars and the winners of the scholarships. It's really been quite an impressive afternoon. Very inspiring things are going on here. I'm not going to show any slides. I'm just going to stand here and talk. So those of you on the sides, if you want to move in, that's fine with me. I don't mind. If you want to have a cricked neck at the end of the day, that's fine with me too. I don't mind that either. I'm going to talk this afternoon about the past and the present and the future of water. I'm going to talk about what I think is, I think we're in the middle of a transition to what I hope will be a truly sustainable future for water. I think that transition's going on now. I think we're moving in the right direction slowly, but I think there are going to be some bumps in the road. And so what I'd like to do is describe where we've been and where I think we're going or could go. As we get older, both as individuals and as a society, and I'm sort of sorry Tad told you how old I was, we absorb more knowledge and more information, more insight from the world around us, from experience, from our contacts with peers and associates, and from others. We face new challenges, there are new opportunities, circumstances change, the world evolves. Someone made the comment at the symposium this afternoon that it seems like the world is going faster and faster. And maybe again, that's just because I'm getting older and older, but I think the world's going faster and faster. Information is flowing faster. It just seems like we have less and less time to react to the things around us, to the challenges we face. Less and less time to put in place some of the policies that I think we know we ought to put in place in order to avoid some of the bad things I think we know we want to avoid. How often do we hear the comment or hear someone say, gee, I wish for the good old days, the golden ages gone by. Life used to be simpler. I wish that we did things today the way we did things differently in the old days. I think a lot of that is wishful thinking. I think the belief in a golden age is a belief in something that didn't really occur, never really happened, but we hear it often. History is ripe with golden ages. There was the golden age of Athens and Greece, the golden age of England under Elizabeth I, the golden 20s in the US, and lots of other things. But one characteristic of golden ages is they don't seem to last that long. Another is that in hindsight, maybe they weren't all that golden after all. And maybe much of the lament for the good old days is misplaced. And in my talk today, I'm going to argue that that's the case for fresh water and for society's experience and history in managing fresh water. I think that overall, we're better off today, on average, than we were 100 years ago or 200 years ago or longer in terms of water. Not just here in North America, but in most places. Not everywhere, but in most places. But I also think that our best days, our golden age, if you will, is in front of us. It's still to come. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe 3 ages of water, new challenges that face us, the concept of peak water, the human right to water, and new tools and approaches that are becoming available to deal with our water problems, specifically something that I call the soft path for water. I'm also going to talk about Mesopotamia and 19th century poetry, and Sumerian myths, and the Syrian civil war, and typhoid, and the Great Lakes, and climate change, and Kashmiri proverbs, and corporate sustainability, and the Green Revolution, all of which, as you know, are all related to water. So that I can stop now. So for most of the people living on Earth, the first age of these 3 ages extended from ancient prehistoric times up until around the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the Renaissance perhaps, from the 14th to the 17th century. So before that time, this first age of water really meant taking water from wherever you were and then dumping your wastes back into wherever you were. It was a simple time. Our rivers and streams were the sources of the water that we used, and they were the sinks for our detritus and our wastes. And when the population of the planet was small and dispersed, that worked okay. Life was pretty short and miserable anyway. And so water-related diseases, such as they were unknown or buried in the other horrible things that mostly happened to people in the first age. Malnutrition, plagues, complications of childbirth, much more. This was certainly not a golden age. But that first age of water began to end when growing concentrations of people required more centralized services than had previously been required before, including water services. The second age of water, if you will, began in pockets of civilization when we had to start growing food for larger and larger communities and larger villages and irrigating some land. And so they began in the agricultural fields of ancient Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley and the earliest cities of the Romans and the Greeks and elsewhere. In some ways, though, the second age really began to flower in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this was a period of time in Europe and to some degree in North America when cities were reaching a critical size, when they were outgrowing and contaminating their water resources. Black Death had decimated Europe, worsened by growing populations without safe water or sanitation, and by a society that had limited understanding of science and technology and medicine. And the subsequent Renaissance included a blossoming not just of art and music and natural philosophy, but a fairly rapid expansion of science and technology and engineering ingenuity. An important part of this scientific revolution, an important part of this beginning of the second age of water, was the development of the scientific method, with its emphasis on empirical evidence and creation of hypotheses and testing of hypotheses and modification of hypotheses. And early and influential proponents of the scientific method were people like Copernicus and Galileo and Francis Bacon, not without opposition from ideology and ideological corners, as Galileo, for example, experienced for the rest of his life. But the scientific method also led to enormous advances in fields like engineering and medicine and science and construction and technology. And it was true for medicine and astronomy and biology and physics, and it was true for our understanding of the environment and water as well. Indeed, by the early 1800s in Europe, there was a growing understanding that we were fouling our own nests. And the famous poet Coleridge wrote in 1828, "The river Rhine, it is well known, doth wash the city of Cologne. But tell me, nymphs, what powers divine shall henceforth wash the river Rhine?" It was a cesspool, everybody knew it, they couldn't drink water out of the Rhine. 1828, there was a growing awareness that we could not do what we were doing any longer. There were times in the early 1830s and 1840s and 1850s when Parliament in London had to shut down in the summer because the Thames was such a cesspool that they couldn't stand the smell. So they were aware about the consequences, or some of the consequences, of uncontrolled water pollution. And in particular, water pollution from human wastes. But water pollution from human wastes had other consequences. By the middle part of the 19th century, 1800s, cholera and dysentery were rampant in cities from Asia to the New World. Cholera outbreaks in the mid-1800s spread around the world from Asia to Europe to the New World. Ships brought cholera to New Orleans and up the Mississippi River and out the Oregon Trail to the western territories of the new United States. Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, London, Moscow all experienced terrible outbreaks of cholera that killed thousands or tens of thousands of people at a time. Cholera first reached Canada in 1832. There was a massive outbreak in 1832, another outbreak in 1834 that reached Toronto and here, and then in 1849, and then in 1851, and 1852, and 1854. It was an ongoing problem. And there was a debate at the time, was cholera caused by some miasma, some fog in the air? Was it caused by waterborne disease? They didn't really know, but they were learning. And they finally realized, as science progressed, that it was a water-related disease. And I would note that the cholera outbreaks in Canada brought a backlash against immigration and immigrants to Canada. Those dirty immigrants from Britain was the problem at the time. But as scientists started to make these connections between water-related diseases and contaminated water and the byproducts of a rapidly growing industrial society, there was a bit of a revolution in water science. And we started to apply some of those things we learned about science and medicine and technology and engineering to water. And so we saw the first machines developed to deal with large-scale water supply, the first physical and chemical and biological treatment of water for large centralized volumes of waste, for example. We saw the first dams built of enormous scale to capture floodwaters and prevent damaging floods, or to supply water in dry periods, or to produce that new magical thing called electricity. We developed and deployed technology to build aqueducts not tens or hundreds of kilometers long, powered by gravity, but thousands of kilometers long, lifting water over mountains with that magical technology of electricity. We saw the first large-scale irrigation systems, really large-scale irrigation systems, designed to permit farmers to grow food on a massive scale in times and places not previously permitted before. This was the second age of water, and we all grew up in that age of water, and we're still living in the second age of water, and we've all benefited from it. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, the water-related diseases that were rampant in the 1800s are gone from the richer industrialized countries of the world. We're feeding 7 billion people now because of the Green Revolution, which was in part as much a revolution of irrigation as it was of fertilizer and pesticide and chemical application. We have sophisticated water systems to protect us from floods and droughts sometimes, and deliver water and take away wastewater. And the truth is, we take almost all of it for granted. We take it for granted. We turn on the tap and it's there. We flush our toilets and it magically goes away. And we take that revolution, that second age of water, for granted, most of us. But as we enter the 21st century, things are changing again. Water is once again taking center stage as one of the most critical resource issues facing humanity. Why? Because despite the enormous effort of the second age of water, because in spite of our technology and economics and industry and engineering strength and scientific advancements, despite the hundreds of billions of dollars or more spent by utilities and towns and governments and institutions, we still have a global water crisis. Not only have we not solved all of our water problems, But looking forward, there are a whole series of new ones developing now that we had better start to learn how to address. So what do I mean when I say we have a global water crisis? What is it? What does it look like? So let me describe a little bit about the nature of the problems that face us, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the solutions and this positive vision that I think we can have for the future. So first of all, populations are growing, and we're failing still to meet basic human needs for water and sanitation for everyone on the planet. And if there's any single aspect of a water crisis that can really be described as a global problem, it's that failure. It's the failure to meet basic human needs for water and sanitation for everyone, no matter what the size of our population. There are nearly 1 billion people today without access to safe drinking water. 2.5 billion people, probably 35 or 40% of the world's population, without access to adequate sanitation. And the consequences of that failure to meet basic human needs for water are water-related diseases: cholera, typhoid, dysentery, schistosomiasis, guinea worm, the diseases that mostly we've forgotten about in the richer countries of the world because we've put in place the water infrastructure to get rid of those diseases. And the consequences are hundreds of millions of cases of disease and 2 or 3 million deaths a year from preventable water-related diseases. We know how to prevent these diseases. There's no mystery to this medicine. It's safe water and sanitation for all. Cholera still sickens and kills many people worldwide. We're now a year away from 2015. 2015 was the target dates for the Millennium Development Goals set in the year 2000 to reduce a whole series of indicators associated with poverty. And we've made great progress on some of those indicators. 2 of them were water, to reduce by half, not to eliminate, but to reduce by half the year 2000 proportion of people without access to water and sanitation. We've made somewhat better progress on the water side, not so good on the sanitation side. But even if we met those goals by 2015, which we won't, there will be hundreds of millions of people or billions of people for sanitation without access to basic human needs for water. And recently, the UN declared access to safe water and sanitation a human right, a legal human right. But we have a long way to go to satisfy that right. Second, water quality problems still plague us, both human wastes and industrial wastes, in different forms, in different places, and of course, this is related to the problem of water-related diseases as well. The Great Lakes are far cleaner than they used to be in many ways, but water quality threats still remain. And there was a great session this afternoon talking about the progress we've made in satisfying some of our objectives in cleaning up the Great Lakes, but lamenting the problems that still remain, that we have failed still to address, and the difficulty in addressing the problems that still remain. And here we are, we're sort of equidistant between Ontario and Huron and Lake Erie. We're sort of in a perfect place to talk about those particular problems. Just yesterday, in the news, there were photographs of the James River in Virginia on fire. Now, I'm sure most of you know, a big part of the environmental movement in North America was stimulated in 1969 when the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire. Now, the reality is the Cuyahoga River first caught fire in 1868, not 1969, 1868. And it was not the water that was burning, it was the industrial wastes that were burning. But in 1969, there were televisions, and people watched televisions, and it was a defining moment in North American environmental activism. And that helped stimulate a lot of the changes that led to the improvements in water quality in the Great Lakes. Yesterday, and again, it wasn't the James River that caught fire, it wasn't actually industrial wastes in the James River. There happened to have been a railroad derailment, and oil tankers fell into the river, spilling oil into the river, and that's what was burning. The James River itself is a lot cleaner than it used to be. But it was an indication that we have a long way to go to adequately protect our water resources. It was another visual indication that we need to do a better job. And maybe a better example is not yesterday's disaster on the James River, but a month ago, we had a terrible chemical waste spill in West Virginia, and 300,000 people in West Virginia went without water for a month because their water supply had been contaminated by another industrial pollution incident. By the way, Time magazine in 1969, when they wrote about the Cuyahoga River, described it as, quote, the river that oozes rather than flows, in which a person does not drown but decays. So those were the days when the media was a little more flowery than they were today. But there's an old Kashmiri proverb that this isn't a new problem. I mean, a centuries-old Kashmiri proverb that says, it's easy to throw anything into a river and difficult to take it out again. And that says it all. Third, food production requires a lot of water. 80% of the water that humans use worldwide goes to food production. And we've done remarkable things with food production worldwide, largely irrigated agriculture. But we face new challenges. And this, again, is partly related to the population question. Populations are growing. We're feeding 7+ billion people now. Population's going to 8 and then 9, and I'm not sure where it's going to level off, but we have to meet growing food demands for a growing population. And the area of irrigated land worldwide is steady or growing slightly, but it's growing less quickly than population, which means per capita irrigated land is falling. The amount of land per person irrigated is falling. That means we have to get more and more out of what we're already doing. We have little additional land, and interestingly, and perhaps more critically, we have little additional water. By some estimates, as much as 30% of our agricultural production worldwide comes from unsustainable groundwater overdraft. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. But we can't keep doing that. That's not a renewable resource, that's a non-renewable resource. And when so much of our current food production comes from a non-renewable resource, that should raise alarm bells, and it does. Fourth, the conflict between human uses of water and ecosystem uses of water are enormous, and they're growing. For too long, humans have taken the water we need out of the ecosystems that also sustain us, but that in the 20th century and the 19th century we didn't understand sustained us. And as a result, those ecosystems, which provide us with goods and services, like clean water, are now being devastated. There are rivers around the world that no longer reach their deltas. The Colorado River, the Yellow River for many parts of the year, the Nile River, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya in the former Soviet Union in Central Asia. We can all point, I think, to a local lake or a local river or local stream that is contaminated beyond the point where we can drink it or swim in it or use it for anything other than a waste discharge. So there are enormous implications on the environmental side for the way we deal with water resources. But we're also changing the climate. And this is going to have very serious impacts on water. In many ways, the hydrologic cycle, which you remember from 5th grade, right? Evaporation, formation of clouds, condensation, precipitation back to the ground or the oceans, back to the oceans, back to evaporation. The hydrologic cycle is the climate cycle. And as we change the climate, which we're already doing, there is enormous evidence that water resources will be among the most important impacts, consequences, victims of climate change. There will be changes in water availability, changes in water demand by humans and by crops, for example, changes in water temperature and quality in rivers and lakes, changes in precipitation patterns, rainfall, changes in snowfall and snowmelt dynamics, changes in storm frequency and intensity. I'm from California. All of our water comes in storms in the rainy season that are generated off the Pacific, and we're already beginning to see changes in storm dynamics in the Pacific. I think it's safe to say that the recent extreme weather we've already seen is a harbinger of things to come with climate change. And for water resources, it's going to be an enormous and difficult challenge. And water planners are not prepared for that. Fifth, water and politics makes a volatile combination. Competition for fresh water is growing, and Tad talked about this in the introduction. It's something he and I have both worked on for a long time. There's competition for water between users, between nations, between ethnic groups, between upstream users and downstream users, between farmers and cities, between farmers, cities, and the environment. There is growing competition for a limited fixed resource. The truth is, water has been a source of tension and conflict for millennia. One of the things we do at the Pacific Institute is we maintain something called the water conflict chronology. So if you're interested in history, Google water conflict chronology, you'll find it right away. It's at a website called worldwater.org. Water has been a source of tension in the sense of allocations, in the sense of, I want your water. It's been a target or a tool, or water systems have been targets or tools from conflicts that start for completely other reasons, for political reasons or economic reasons or ideological reasons, but where water systems are targets. It's been a political tension for many years. There are just hundreds of examples throughout history. It's not a new issue. In many ways, the first water war, if you will, occurred in ancient Mesopotamia between the city-states of Umma and Lagash over an irrigation canal. I think it was 2500 BC, and it's inscribed on tablets found in ancient Mesopotamia. And it continues up to modern times. In 2012, there were reports of 100 people killed in Kenya in conflicts between pastoralists and farmers over access to water resources during the dry season. I have a paper coming out in a few weeks on the Syrian civil war that looks at the role that drought has played in crippling agriculture in Syria, in causing a displacement of populations from the rural areas of Syria to the cities, and the role that climate change may or may not be playing in that region of the world now at reducing water availability, increasing tensions among the shared rivers. And the truth is, every major river in the Middle East is shared. The Tigris and the Euphrates is shared by Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, and there's no international agreement about how to share that water. The Jordan River is shared by Israel, the Palestinians, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and one more. And it's a tiny river, and it doesn't reach the Dead Sea anymore because it's entirely consumed. The Nile River, when I started this business, was shared by 9 nations, and then it became 10, and now it's 11, not because the Nile River is growing, but because of geopolitics, and countries are splitting, actually maybe 12 now, with Sudan and South Sudan. We think of the Nile River as an Egyptian river, but there are many nations upstream of Egypt on the Nile, and believe me, Egypt is aware of every one of them and what they're doing. Just yesterday, there was a story in the BBC about tensions over water between the Ukraine and Crimea. Apparently there's a canal that supplies probably the majority of Crimea's water that comes from the Ukraine. And believe me, that's causing some concerns already. There are many, many other examples of water and politics making a volatile mix. I believe that many of our water problems stem from the fact that we're reaching what I call peak water, limits to our water resources. Water is a renewable resource, as I've described with the hydrologic cycle. But it's also a non-renewable resource when we overpump groundwater faster than nature recharges it. Then it's like oil. It's a stock. And when we use it faster than nature recharges it, groundwater levels drop, it becomes more expensive to pump, it becomes a problem. And we see this in parts of northern China, in India, in the Ogallala Great Plains Aquifer in the United States, in the Central Valley of California, where we're overdrafting groundwater, and that's led to this problem with agricultural production in the long run. So that's peak non-renewable water, when we overpump groundwater. But peak renewable water is the idea that even when water is a renewable resource, there are limits. You can't have more than even a renewable system provides. That's not a stock constraint like oil or non-renewable groundwater. That's a flow constraint. And when you use the entire flow of a river, it rains again next year, but you can't have more than the entire flow. And we've taken the entire flow of more and more rivers around the world, and that means there are limits. We might want more water from certain systems, but we can't have it. And as we reach these limits, these physical limits to the resource, we have to start thinking about water in a new way. Now, our first traditional reaction to all of these problems is that we just need to pay more attention. We just need to do more of what we've been doing. We need to put more effort into our water, solving our water problems, more money, bigger institutions, train more engineers. And that's what we learned to do in the second age of water. And it worked mostly. But I would like to argue here that doing more of the same is not enough. That doing what we did in the second age of water is not enough. And that the tools and methods that we used brought us enormous benefits, economic, political, social, health, but that we have to look elsewhere for solutions to solve our 21st century water problems. So here's the good news. I think we're living in a transition. I think we're in a period now when we're moving from the second age of water to a new age of water, the third age of water, to an era of sustainable water management and use. And so for the rest of my talk, let me talk about an alternative vision for the future rather than these bad things that I've described that we can see pretty clearly, but know we don't want or know we want to solve, and talk about where I think we can go. And I think there's a lot of good news out there. We live in a period of time when different and innovative ideas are being explored, where a lot more attention is being given to water than 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, where bright, dedicated people are making progress every day on different aspects of these challenges, and I saw lots of those things today. So here's what I see in my crystal ball. I can imagine a world where the human right to water, for safe water and sanitation, is acknowledged and met for 100% of the people on the planet, where water is properly priced and allocated, where cities and farmers collaborate on water policy, where water quality is universally monitored and measured and regulated, where more food is grown with less water, where new technologies are applied to make our tap water even safer than it is now, and in places where it isn't safe, where we make it safe, where corporations have comprehensive and standardized principles for managing their piece of the water puzzle, where aquatic ecosystems are restored and perhaps, dare I say, guaranteed water, where invasive species are not altering our aquatic systems, where groundwater pumping is brought within sustainable limits, and where wastewater isn't thought about as a liability but as an asset, and where conflicts over water are addressed diplomatically and peacefully, not militarily. So let me describe what I call the soft path for water and the pieces of this puzzle that I think are leading us to this third age of water. And there are 5 or 6 of them. First, let's refocus our effort and meet basic human needs for water for everyone. Governments, international aid organizations, corporations, private groups at all levels have to join forces to meet the goal of meeting these minimum needs for safe water and sanitation services. The economic costs of meeting basic human needs for water are not very high. In fact, they're extraordinarily low. Globally, the estimates vary. It depends on what services you want to provide, but $40, $50, $60 billion a year worldwide to meet basic human needs for water for everyone. And that's really a pittance in today's global economy. And the truth is that the economic costs of failing to meet basic human needs for water are staggering. Sometimes they're hard to quantify. We know how much it costs to build a groundwater well or a wastewater treatment plant. How do you quantify the life lost to a young girl who has to walk miles to get safe water, or not even safe water, to bring back home and doesn't get to go to school? What's the opportunity cost of that? Or the health impacts of failing to meet basic human needs for water? And efforts are underway to meet basic human needs for water, but they're not adequate, as I've already described. The world community has an opportunity to play an enormous role here, and we're not yet doing so. And I'm having my own little water problem here, so. Second, we have to address the wrongs done to the environment in the name of water development. It's possible to move back from the ecological damage that we've caused in the name of water development. It's possible to guarantee not just basic human needs for water, but basic ecosystem needs for water, with the same priority as basic human needs for water. And more there are efforts to guarantee minimum flows in watersheds, to return some water rights to the ecosystems. I had the opportunity to do some work in South Africa in the early 90s. South Africa at that time was an incredibly exciting place. They had got rid of their apartheid government. They had thrown out the old apartheid laws and the old institutions. And one of the things they threw out was the old water rights situation, which, as you might imagine, were as inequitable as the other laws of the time. And they wrote a new constitution, I think in 1994. Somebody in the room probably knows better than me. But that South African constitution, 20 years ago, guaranteed the basic human needs for water as a fundamental right, and basic ecosystem needs for water as a fundamental right. It was really a remarkable thing. And sometimes I wish the United States could do the same thing, California could do the same thing, the rest of the world could do the same thing. We're going to have to deal with climate change somehow. Either we're going to have to, well, the truth is we're going to have to deal with it in a lot of ways. We're going to have to deal with emissions of greenhouse gases, but now, unavoidably, because we've dawdled too long, and there are other verbs I could use, we're going to have to adapt to now unavoidable impacts of climate change, including impacts on our water systems. We designed and we built our water systems under the assumption that tomorrow's climate was going to be the same as yesterday's climate. And we now know that's not true. There was a lot of talk about uncertainty today in the climate conversation, in the Great Lakes debate, in the Great Lakes meeting, and then some of the talks about climate itself. Not everything is uncertain. The scientific community has been pretty clear, and incredibly clear in just the last couple of months, with the latest reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has been releasing reports for decades now. We're as certain that humans are changing the climate, not going to change the climate. We're as certain that humans are changing the climate as we are that smoking tobacco causes cancer. It's that level of certainty. There are uncertainties about things. There are plenty of uncertainties. There are plenty of good science that remains to be done. But not everything is equally uncertain. And I think we need to get beyond the idea that uncertainty is an excuse for inaction. And especially in the area of water resources, we know enough to do a lot to prepare for the changing dynamics of our hydrologic system. This is a question of risk, not uncertainty. I have car insurance, not because I know I'm going to drive into a tree or that I'm going to, in an unfortunate way, meet some other incompetent driver, but just in case that happens. We buy insurance for things that might happen, that we don't want to happen. We ought to buy ourselves a great deal of climate insurance. Unfortunately, the premiums now are higher than they would have been 20 years ago. Third, we have to rethink both supply and demand, what we mean by supply and demand for water, and become more productive in our use of water in every sector, in every community, in every way. There's inefficient, wasteful use of water in every part of our economy, in every industry, from commerce to our homes to our farms. Our goal is not to use water, except for really basic things like drinking, cooking, really fundamental basic human needs. Our goal is to provide us with goods and services that we want. Food, semiconductors, transportation, entertainment. We want things. Almost all the things that we want require water in some form. But I would like to argue that almost all of the things that we want require less water than we're spending to do those things. And that's this issue of efficiency and productivity and demand. If we can improve the efficiency and productivity of our water use, if we can satisfy our demands with less water, we reduce the pressure on our ecosystems. We reduce the pressure on the environment. We reduce competition and political disputes over water resources. If we can do those things, we'll be better off with less pressure on the hydrologic cycle. And again, the good news is that's already happening. The demand for water has always been assumed to be tied to population and economic growth. Our population is still growing, our economy is still growing, but increasingly in parts of the world, our demand for water is no longer growing. In the United States, we actually use less water today than we used 30 years ago for everything. Agriculture, power plant cooling, commercial uses, industrial uses, washing clothes in homes, watering lawns, things that maybe we shouldn't be doing. We're actually using less water today than 30 years ago, and our populations continue to grow and our economies continue to grow. And that's an improvement in water use productivity and efficiency. And it's true in California, it's true in Los Angeles, it's true in big cities. It's a remarkable change from that assumption that demand has to grow with population and the economy. The truth is we've started to tap into wasteful and inefficient use as a new source of water, if you will. And we've done it through improved technology and better use of economics and markets and smarter regulations and a whole series of tools, which I'll talk about in a moment. But just to give you some quick examples. In the 1920s in North America, it used to take 200 tons of water to make a ton of steel in the 1920s. In the 1980s, it was about 20 tons of water to make a ton of steel. From 200 tons to make a ton to 20 tons. That's a 90% drop in the water use required to make a ton of steel. Now, we didn't do that because we were trying to save water. We did it because because the Cuyahoga River caught fire and the Great Lakes were dying, water quality laws that told our industries you could no longer dump untreated sewage and waste and industrial contaminants into our rivers and streams. And it turns out one of the easiest ways to cut industrial water pollution is to use less water to do what you're doing. So they changed their practices, and one of those improvements, one of the benefits of that was improvements in water quality, but another benefit was an improvement in water use efficiency. They just cut their discharges. Now the truth is today, it takes 3 or 4 tons of water to make a ton of steel in the most efficient steel plants worldwide. That's another 90% drop, 80% drop from 20. So we're making more steel with less water. It used to take 30 gallons of water to make a square inch of semiconductors. Now it takes 5 or 6 in the best semiconductor manufacturing plants worldwide. It used to take 6 or 7 tons of water to water a hectare of agricultural land. Now it takes 3 or 4 through improvements in irrigation efficiency. And there are many, many other examples I could give. So that's the demand side of the equation. But there are improvements on the supply side that we can look at as well. So supply in the 20th century, in the second age of water, meant build another dam, store more water, build another aqueduct to move water from farther and farther away, drill another groundwater well. But we're reaching peak water. There are limits to traditional supplies. We can't have more water out of the Colorado River, as I've described. We can't overpump more water from our overpumped aquifers. But there are new things we can do on the supply side. So for example, again, as part of the second age of water, we learned to collect our wastewater and to treat it, often to a remarkably high standard. And then we threw it away. We threw it in the ocean. That's an asset, not a liability. And increasingly, we've learned that our treated wastewater can be used for all sorts of things, up to and including potable drinking water. We can treat wastewater to any standard we want, including the highest quality potable drinking water. And in many parts of the world now, treated wastewater is a component of supply, water supply. And often it's used for non-potable uses, for groundwater recharge, for agriculture, for landscapes, for power plant cooling, for industrial use, for flushing toilets, but increasingly for potable use as well. Treated wastewater is an asset. It's a new source of supply. In California, we're just about to release a study showing that there's an enormous amount of water, probably 20 to 30% of our current total urban demand, available in treated wastewater. And that's just one example. They use it in Namibia and have for decades. Singapore uses highly treated wastewater as water supply. And there are other sources of new supply as well. Stormwater capture, traditional forms of rainwater harvesting, smart conjunctive use of surface water and groundwater together. All of these, up to and including desalination of seawater, are potential new sources of supply that could be tapped if they're properly designed and planned and built. Fourth, we have to protect water quality. A top priority is protecting the quality of our tap water, our potable water. Most of our tap water is superb. Some of it could be better. And there are new technologies out there to deal with many of the new contaminants that we're discovering in our tap water now, that either weren't there before or were there, but now we can measure them because our technologies for measuring water quality has improved. And that partly requires updating our technology, but it also partly requires updating our water quality laws. We need to bring our 1970s and 1980 water quality laws into the 21st century. And we have to move from the narrow, linear, single contaminant thinking to thinking about multiple contaminants and synergistic effects and non-point source problems. Some of the things we heard about in the Great Lakes session this afternoon, and some of the things that we're dealing with in other parts of the world as well. We should also recognize that some qualities of water some demands for water require different qualities of water. We use high quality potable water to flush our toilets. And that's because that's the way we built our system. Some parts of the world we use high quality potable water to water our lawns. The truth is, in a water scarce world, if we were starting from scratch, that would be ridiculous. If we were starting from scratch and we had limits to our water resources and we understood those limits, and somebody suggested, I'm going to treat my water to potable water quality standard, I'm going to use it to flush my toilet or water my lawn, somebody else in the room, I hope, would laugh them out of the room. But that's the system we have. Let's recognize the flaws in that system and move slowly to redesign and remanage and re-engineer our system to match the quality of water we have with the quality of the water we need. Fifth, let's use smart economics to deal with our water challenges. The failure to price water properly leads to overuse, and it leads to underinvestment, and it leads to poor economic decisions. Most of us do not pay enough for water. Most of us pay far less for water than we pay for our internet connection per month, or our electricity, or natural gas, or our cable TV, or any of our utilities. But which one in the morning when you get up and it doesn't work would you be most upset to find? And I'm going to suggest it's your water. But I would note that we also have to price water fairly. Water is a human right. The UN so declared in 2010. So water is a human right. It's an economic good. How do you match those two things? Where do they conflict? The fact that water is a human right doesn't mean it shouldn't be priced, or that water services shouldn't be priced. It does mean that you cannot deny someone access to basic water needs because of an inability to pay. And so figuring out the balance between the human right to water and the economic value of water is part of our challenge moving forward. Let's recognize both of those things and figure out how to deal with them. And finally, we have to improve our water institutions. Nelson Mandela said, referring to water, interestingly enough, quote, "It is one thing to find fault with an existing system. It is another thing altogether, a more difficult task, to replace it with another approach that is better." We have to manage water for the third age, not for the second age. And that means our institutions have to change. It means our universities have to change. We need water institutes that are interdisciplinary, that bring together the engineering, the environmental sciences, the economics, the sociology, the politics in an integrated way. Universities aren't great at being interdisciplinary. The opportunity for an institute, like the one here, to cut across those disciplines is critically important for water. Because if we're going to manage water for the third age, we have to teach water differently than we taught it in the past. It means utilities and engineers are going to have to think differently about water management. They're going to have to integrate a different kind of climate variability into their planning for floods and droughts and reservoir design and water distribution systems. We need new collaborations between farmers and environmentalists in industry and the energy sector and water agencies. I'm not going to talk much about this, but water and energy are closely connected. It takes water to produce energy, it takes energy to produce water, but we manage water over here and we manage energy over here, and it's inefficient. And if we manage them both together, there would be benefits for both sectors. It's possible to streamline government regulations without reducing the protection that those regulations provide. Certainly in my country, there is an anti-regulation mentality today, which I lament, because the reality is regulations are a fundamental part of our water system. And when regulations are inefficient, streamline them, change them, but don't get rid of them. We have a single national standard now for the efficiency of washing machines, dishwashers, toilets, shower heads. We had one state standard and then 5 state standards, and they were a little different. And then we had 50 state standards, and then the manufacturers who didn't want any regulation said, wait a minute, I don't want to make 50 models of toilets. I want a national standard. Smart regulation can play an important role, and that's part of our management challenge as well. And more efforts like these are going to be required in the coming decades. So what will the future really bring? Can we reach this rosy, positive, sustainable future, or are we condemned to a perpetual water crisis? A future maybe we can see more clearly, but one that we clearly know we don't want. I don't know. I don't know where we're going to end up. The gloomy pessimists don't know where we're going to end up either, I would note. And I don't know because the answer depends on decisions that we make as individuals and as scholars and as educators and as regulators and as members of our community and as politicians and policymakers. The third age of water means we have to shift the way we think about water from the second age to this new way of thinking. I think that shift is underway, and I hope that we can continue to find ways to encourage it. Thank you very much.
Peter has agreed to answer some questions. If you're going to ask a question, we'd like you to ask it into a microphone, and these students are going to pass the microphone. So, questions?
Okay, there's two areas pertaining to water that I feel aren't being given sufficient attention. On They go, they pass through the sewage plant, they pass through the water treatment plant. And they also get on their farms with this residual that comes from the sewage treatment plant. And that gets into our water courses and our food and so on.
Right.
It's very difficult to remove them from the truck. The other thing very briefly I'm concerned about is the whole area of hydrogen sulfide gas being exponentially increasingly released from our oceans. It's a neurotoxin among other things. There's even stories of similar types of releases in the bottom. You know, it's happening now to some extent. It's going to get worse as the oceans degrade, as they become more acidic, as we put more nutrients in, garbage and so on. It won't be jellyfish we have to worry about, too many of those. It'll be increasing with hydrogen sulfide from hydrogen sulfide gas producing bacteria.
So let me,
Those are the two things you'd like to comment.
yeah, let me make a comment especially about the first one. So endocrine disruptors are a good example of chemicals that are in some of our water supplies that we didn't regulate because we didn't know about them in the 1970s and 1980s, or they weren't as big a problem in that time. We didn't regulate for them. And our ability to detect very, very minute concentrations of chemicals has improved enormously. That was one of the things that I was referring to indirectly when I talked about the need to improve our tap water system. Interestingly, there were some wonderful research projects that I saw this afternoon associated with trying to understand what's in our water supplies and the ability of different water treatment systems to remove different kinds of new contaminants like endocrine disruptors. And the truth is we need more research like that in a number of ways. We need to understand what's in our water better. We need to understand what the health impacts really are of what's in our water, and that's a complicated, unknown question. And we need to figure out how to remove the things that are bad. And that's the challenge, that's one of the biggest challenges our urban municipal water systems face in the coming years. And I think we could be up to that challenge, but we need to put a lot more effort into it than we're putting today.
I'd just like to hear some comments from you about the conflict in water. You alluded to some conflict that led, or war, or serious conflict, but there's also some people that talk about water has led to peace, and even countries that are at war still collaborate on water. And I'm wondering what how you see the future in terms of water and conflict.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the truth is anything, sort of, can lead to conflict or cooperation. Any of the things that we argue about, economics, politics, religion, ideology, resources, can be sources of conflict or cooperation. And water's the same way. There's a lot of work that's been done on international conflicts of water, over water, conflicts between nations. That's an area where there's a lot of experience with cooperation. There's a long history of diplomacy, negotiation, water treaties. There are hundreds of treaties on rivers that are shared between two or more nations. I think there's enormous opportunity and experience with cooperation over water, and I acknowledge that. So I didn't mean to leave the impression that water always leads to conflict. However, it does sometimes lead to conflict, and it leads to conflicts in areas where we don't have agreements, where diplomacy fails, where there are multiple factors involved, and increasingly, it leads to conflict at the subnational level, not nation to nation, but ethnic group versus ethnic group. The example of Kenya was a good example between pastoralists and nomads who migrate in the wet season and the dry season, and farmers who don't. Upstream users and downstream users in India, between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, two states within India, over the Calvary River, has led to violence. Our ability to deal with these subnational examples of conflicts aren't as good. We don't have the tools for diplomacy as well as we do as at the international level. And I actually worry more about those subnational examples than the national ones. I do worry at the national level about some rivers as water is a contributing factor in conflict. I also didn't mean to suggest the conflict in Syria was due to water. The conflict in Syria is obviously a long-standing political, ideological, religious, ethnic conflict. But I do mean to suggest that I think water played a role. And I think drought played a role in its influence on agriculture and the failure of the economy of the time, and it contributed to the complex dynamics that lie behind almost any kind of conflict.
Thanks very much for your talk. I want to, you mentioned that the way forward is through the soft path. Some of us know and are familiar with the soft path, but I thought perhaps you might expand for the audience here. What do you mean by a soft path to water? And my question to you is, isn't the soft path really the hard path?
Yeah, okay, thanks. So in 1976 or 77, a guy named Amory Lovins wrote a book called The Soft Energy Paths. And I haven't read it for a number of years, but the idea that Amory laid out was that the hard energy path was centralized fossil fuel and nuclear construction. And that in fact, that solution alone wasn't going to solve our energy problems, but we had to think not just about supply, but about demand. And we had to think not just about utilities, but about communities and about economics. And I've known Amory since 1977, actually. And the idea of the soft path for water is a similar one. What it means is we need more than hard physical infrastructure. And I don't mean to suggest we don't need new infrastructure. In many parts of the world, we do need more dams and more water treatment systems and better distribution systems and so on. But we need to combine infrastructure with new thinking about demand. It's not just supply, it's demand. It's not just engineering, it's economics. It's not just decision-making in a centralized fashion, it's involvement of communities in decision-making. So that's what I mean about the soft path. And the examples I gave about solutions, about supply and demand and institutions and economics is really what I mean about the soft path. Oh, is it the hard path in the sense of difficult? Yes, but I don't think it's harder than the hard path that we've taken. And I don't think the second age of water, the solutions on the second age of water are going to be enough. They don't say anything about climate change and variability. They failed to deal with the ecological problems because they ignored the environment. They didn't understand the human right to water and the economic value of water. We need more interdisciplinary thinking, and I think that's the only way out of our dilemma. And I think the good news is that's the way we're beginning to think. I just wish, I'm not going to say it's easy, but I think it's easier than the alternative. Let me put it that way.
We'll take one more question. A few more.
Well, I'm just curious about what you see as the impact of the Fukushima disaster on the world's hydrologic system. I just pulled up something on the internet on my phone, and it said, I don't know the legitimacy of the source, but it said that the North Pacific is dead, for example. And obviously and I've heard the stories of like radioactive tuna washing up on the shores of California, and obviously this would quickly get spread throughout the world's hydrologic system and certainly throughout the oceans of the world. So, and is there technology to purify radiation from water currently?
Okay, so I probably don't need to say this, but not everything you read on the internet is true. There's a digression for that, but all right, having said that, Fukushima was a terrible disaster. It was a disaster of design, it was a disaster of engineering, and it was a natural disaster. The radiation contamination in the Fukushima area is terrible, and some of that has entered the Pacific. The Pacific is very big. It's diluting. There will be, I may be out on a limb here, but there will be no radiological impact of note on fisheries at the grand scale or on the west coast of the United States. If I lived in Japan, I would not eat fish caught near Fukushima. I think it's going to be a local problem, and it's going to be a local problem for hundreds of years, possibly. I just don't think it's going to be a global problem, and I wouldn't worry about that. There are ways of taking radioactive contaminants out of water. They're incredibly expensive, and the best thing is not to let radiation contaminate our water resources. It's sort of the answer I would give about contaminants in general. The best way to deal with contamination is to prevent it in the first place. Ironically, I think Fukushima is going to have a much bigger impact in the long run on the global energy situation and the way we think about nuclear energy. And again, in some senses, the good news is I think we're in a transition in the energy world as well. I think we're going to move much more rapidly toward renewables, in part because the liabilities of fossil fuels are so blindingly obvious now to most people, and the liabilities of nuclear energy, in part because of Fukushima, but in part because of economics and waste issues and proliferation issues are blindingly obvious now as well. And so I think that's going to be part of the transition that we're seeing. Thank you very much.